From the dawn of creation to the fall of Jericho's walls, one chapter holds the secret that changed everything. Hebrews 11 isn't just another passage, it's the hall of fame of faith, where ordinary people did the impossible. Here, a shepherd's sacrifice speaks louder than death. A man walks with God and never dies. An old woman laughs her way into motherhood, and a prince trades a throne for slavery. What made these ancient heroes unstoppable? What power turned cowards into conquerors and transformed the weak into warriors? The answer lies hidden in 39 verses that reveal why this single chapter might be the most revolutionary text ever written. The writer of Hebrews begins chapter 11 with a statement that would echo through centuries of Christian history. In verse 1, he declares, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." These words aren't just a definition, they're a doorway into understanding how God's people have always lived. Faith isn't about closing your eyes and wishing really hard for something to happen. It's about being completely sure of what you're hoping for, even when you can't touch it or see it yet. Think about it like this. When you sit in a chair, you don't wonder if it will hold you. You just sit down because you trust it will work. That's confidence. Faith works the same way with God's promises. You can't see heaven, you can't physically touch God's love, and you can't hold tomorrow in your hands. But faith gives you a kind of spiritual vision that makes these invisible things more real than the ground beneath your feet. It's the evidence of things you cannot see with your eyes, but know deep in your soul are true. This isn't blind belief or empty hope. It's a solid foundation that people have built their entire lives upon, and as we'll discover, some even died for it. The writer chose these specific words carefully. Confidence speaks to an inner certainty that doesn't shake when circumstances get difficult. Assurance means you're so convinced of something that you act on it without hesitation. When you put these together, you get a picture of faith that's active, alive, and powerful. It's not passive waiting, it's bold living based on trust in God's character and promises. This definition becomes the lens through which we'll view every story that follows in this chapter. The Greek word, translated as confidence, carries the meaning of something substantial, something that gives your life stability and foundation. It's not wishful thinking or crossing your fingers and hoping things work out. It's a deep-rooted conviction that what God has promised will absolutely come to pass. The word for assurance speaks to proof or evidence, but not the kind you can measure in a laboratory. It's the internal evidence that convinces your heart and mind that God's invisible realities are more trustworthy than anything you can physically observe. Throughout history, millions of believers have staked their lives on this kind of faith, walking forward into unknown futures because they trusted the one who promised to be with them. Moving to verse 2, the writer makes a powerful statement. This is what the ancients were commended for. The word ancients here refers to the elders, the heroes of old who came before. These weren't perfect people, and they didn't have all the answers we have today. They didn't have the complete Bible to read. They didn't have churches to attend every Sunday. Many of them lived in times when very little was known about God's full plan. Yet somehow, these ancient believers gained God's approval. How? Through faith. God looked at their lives and said, "Well done." He commended them. He praised them. He held them up as examples for every generation that would follow. This verse serves as an introduction to the parade of heroes we're about to meet. It's telling us that what made these people special wasn't their strength, their wisdom, or their status. It was simply their faith. God noticed their trust in Him, and He marked it down in Scripture so we would never forget. These elders weren't commended for being flawless. They were commended because, when it mattered most, they believed God and acted on that belief. The word commended carries weight. It means God Himself gave testimony about them. He witnessed their faith and spoke favorably about it. Imagine the creator of the universe personally praising someone for their trust in him. That's what happened with these ancient believers. Their faith caught God's attention in such a profound way that he made sure their stories would be told forever. This verse sets up an important expectation. We're about to see what faith looks like in action, lived out through real people facing real challenges. These weren't mythical figures or legendary superheroes. They were ordinary human beings who made a choice to trust God even when everything around them said they shouldn't. Some of them lived in times of great danger, others faced impossible situations. Many of them never saw the fulfillment of what they believed for during their lifetimes. But all of them received God's approval because they refused to stop believing. The writer wants us to understand that faith has always been the currency that matters most to God, more valuable than any achievement or religious performance we could offer him. In verse 3, something interesting happens. Before diving into stories about people, the writer takes us back to the very beginning, to creation itself. He writes, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." This verse connects faith to the most fundamental question humans have ever asked. Where did everything come from? The writer says we understand creation by faith. Science can study the stars, measure the earth, and analyze the smallest particles, but the ultimate origin of all things requires faith to grasp. God spoke, and the universe came into existence. The mountains, the oceans, the stars, the animals, the first humans, all of it appeared at his command. Nothing visible was made from materials that already existed. God didn't need building blocks or raw materials. He created everything from nothing, simply by speaking. This is important because it establishes God's power right from the start. If he can create entire galaxies with just his word, then he can certainly keep the promises he makes to his people. Faith in God's creative power becomes the foundation for trusting him with everything else. When you believe God made the world from nothing, believing he can handle your problems becomes much easier. The phrase, "at God's command," emphasizes the authority and power behind creation. God didn't struggle or labor over creation. He commanded it into existence. His word alone was enough to bring forth light, separate waters, form dry land, and fill the earth with life. This creative word is the same word that speaks promises to his people. This verse also addresses a deeper truth. The visible world came from the invisible. Everything we can touch, see, and measure originated from God's invisible power and will. This flips our normal way of thinking. We tend to trust only what we can see and prove. But the writer is saying that the invisible realm is actually more foundational than the physical one. Faith allows us to grasp this reality and live accordingly. When you walk outside and see trees, mountains, rivers, and sky, faith reminds you that none of this existed until God spoke it into being. The complexity of a single human cell, the precision of planetary orbits, the beauty of a sunset, all of it points back to a creator who designed everything with purpose and care. You can study the mechanics of how things work, but faith is what helps you understand who made it all happen and why. This understanding shapes how you view everything else in life. If God created the entire universe from nothing, then nothing in your life is too difficult for him to handle. Now the writer introduces us to the first person in this hall of faith, Abel, one of Adam and Eve's sons. Verse 4 tells us, "By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks even though he is dead." Abel's story takes us back to Genesis, where we learn he was a shepherd while his brother Cain was a farmer. Both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain brought some of his crops, but Abel brought the best portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. God looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but he didn't accept Cain's offering. Why? The difference wasn't just in what they brought. It was in the faith behind the offering. Abel's sacrifice came from a heart that trusted God and wanted to give him the very best. He understood that approaching God required more than just going through the motions. It required faith, sincerity, and a genuine desire to honor the Lord. God commended Abel as righteous because his offering revealed his faith. The act of bringing the firstborn of his flock wasn't random. It showed Abel believed God deserved the first and the best, not the leftovers. It demonstrated that Abel valued his relationship with God above his own material wealth. When you give God your best, you're saying through your actions that He matters most. Abel didn't wait to see if his flock would grow larger before giving. He didn't hold back the best animals for himself and give God the weaker ones. He trusted that honoring God first would be worth it, even if it cost him something valuable. This kind of faith-filled worship stands in stark contrast to religious duty done out of obligation. Abel worshipped because he believed in God's worthiness, not because he was trying to earn something or check off a religious requirement. His offering flowed from faith, and that's what made all the difference. Tragically, Cain became so jealous that he killed his brother Abel. The first death in human history came because one brother couldn't stand seeing another brother's faith honored by God. But here's the remarkable part. Even though Abel died thousands of years ago, his faith still speaks. His example still teaches us. His story still matters. Through Scripture, Abel's voice echoes across time, showing every generation that God values faith-filled worship over empty rituals. Abel never wrote a book, never preached a sermon, never led a movement, but his one act of faithful worship left a legacy that continues to this day. Every time someone chooses to give God their best instead of their leftovers, Abel's faith speaks. Every time someone worships from a sincere heart rather than just following traditions, Abel's example lives on. Death couldn't silence his testimony because God recorded it in His eternal word. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground when Cain killed him, but his faith continues to cry out through the pages of Scripture, teaching us that what we bring to God matters far less than the faith with which we bring it. The next person we meet is Enoch, and his story is unlike anyone else's. Verses 5 and 6 tell us, "By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him." Enoch's life was extraordinary. Genesis tells us that Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years, and then suddenly he wasn't there anymore because God took him. He never died. He simply walked so closely with God that one day God brought him straight to heaven. Imagine living your life so connected to God that you literally walk right into eternity with Him. That's what faith produced in Enoch's life. The phrase "walked with God" suggests an ongoing daily relationship. Enoch didn't just pray occasionally or think about God when things got tough. Walking with someone means you're going in the same direction, keeping the same pace, sharing the journey together. For 300 years, Enoch maintained this intimate connection with God. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, he chose to stay close to the Lord. Then one day, his walk on earth simply continued into heaven without the interruption of death. People looked for Enoch, but couldn't find him because God had taken him away. One moment he was there, the next moment he was gone, transported directly into God's presence. This extraordinary ending to Enoch's earthly life serves as a powerful testimony to what faith can produce. But notice what verse 6 adds. It's one of the most important statements in the entire Bible. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You can't make God happy through good deeds alone, through religious activities, or through trying really hard to be perfect. Faith is the requirement. Why? Because anyone who comes to God must believe two essential things. First, they must believe that He exists. You can't have a relationship with someone you don't believe is real. This isn't about proving God exists through arguments or evidence. It's about personally believing in your heart that God is real and present. Second, they must believe that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. God isn't distant or uninterested. He responds to those who genuinely look for Him. The word earnestly matters here. It's not about casual interest or occasional curiosity. It's about diligently, persistently, wholeheartedly seeking God. Enoch proved both these truths. He believed God existed, he sought Him daily, and God rewarded that faith by bringing him directly into His presence. Enoch's life shows us that faith isn't just about believing correct facts about God. It's about pursuing a relationship with Him that transforms how you live every single day. Faith that pleases God isn't passive. It actively seeks Him, looks for Him, pursues Him with dedication and commitment. Enoch walked with God in a world that was growing increasingly wicked. Genesis tells us that violence and corruption were filling the earth during this time. Yet in the midst of all that darkness, one man chose to walk with God every day for 3 centuries. His faith didn't just change his eternal destination, it changed how he lived every moment of his earthly life. The final person in this opening section is Noah, whose faith led to one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Verse 7 states, "By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith." God came to Noah with disturbing news. He was going to flood the entire earth because of humanity's wickedness. But Noah found favor in God's eyes. God gave him specific instructions to build a massive boat, an ark, that would save his family and preserve animal life. Here's what made Noah's faith remarkable. He had never seen rain before, let alone a flood. The Bible suggests that before the flood, the earth was watered differently. So when God warned Noah about things not yet seen, Noah had to trust completely. For possibly 100 years, Noah worked on this enormous boat, likely facing mockery from his neighbors who thought he was crazy. Can you imagine building a giant ship far from any ocean, telling people a flood was coming when they'd never even seen rain? The ridicule must have been constant. His neighbors probably laughed every time they walked past his construction project. They might have questioned his sanity, mocked his devotion, and dismissed his warnings. But Noah didn't waver. In holy fear, meaning reverent respect for God, he followed every instruction. The phrase, holy fear, is important. Noah wasn't afraid of God in a terrified way. He had a deep reverence that took God's words seriously. When God said judgment was coming, Noah believed it. When God gave specific building plans, Noah followed them exactly. This holy fear motivated obedience even when nothing in Noah's experience confirmed what God was saying. God told Noah the exact dimensions of the ark, what kind of wood to use, how to seal it, where to put the door, and how to construct the different levels. Noah followed these instructions precisely, even though he'd never built anything like this before. He gathered the animals, stored the food, and prepared his family. Day after day, year after year, he worked on this massive construction project that made no sense to anyone around him. His faith sustained him through decades of preparation for an event that seemed impossible. When the rains finally came and the floodwaters rose, that ark saved 8 people: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Through his obedience, Noah condemned the world. His faith-filled actions stood in stark contrast to everyone else's unbelief. While the world laughed and ignored God's warning, Noah believed and acted. His very obedience became a statement about everyone else's rebellion. By building the ark, Noah was essentially saying, God's judgment is real and I'm taking it seriously. His faith exposed the world's faithlessness. The people around Noah had the same opportunity he did. They could have listened to God's warning and joined him in preparing for the flood. But they chose to ignore it, and their unbelief cost them everything. After the flood, God made a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the earth with water. He set a rainbow in the sky as a sign of this promise. Noah became an heir of righteousness, not through perfection, but through faith that led to obedience. Noah's life demonstrates that faith often requires long-term commitment in the face of opposition, sustained effort when you can't see immediate results, and unwavering trust in God's word, even when your circumstances seem to contradict it. For 100 years, Noah saw no sign of rain, no indication that a flood was coming, no evidence that his work mattered. But he kept building because he believed God's warning more than he believed his own eyes. The story now shifts to one of the most significant figures in biblical history. Verses 8 through 10 introduce us to Abraham's extraordinary journey of faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham was living comfortably in Ur of the Chaldeans when God called him to leave everything behind. God told him to go to a land that he would show him, but God didn't give him a map or specific directions. Abraham had to pack up his entire household, leave his relatives and familiar surroundings, and start walking toward a destination he knew nothing about. This wasn't a short trip or a temporary relocation. It was a complete life change based solely on God's promise. Most people won't move to a new city without researching it first, without knowing about job opportunities, housing, and what life will be like there. But Abraham left everything he knew to go to a place he'd never seen, simply because God told him to go. That's faith in action. When Abraham finally arrived in Canaan, the land God promised him, he didn't receive a palace or permanent home. Instead, he lived in tents like a stranger in a foreign country. The land was promised to him, but he never actually owned it during his lifetime. He moved from place to place, setting up temporary camps, living as an outsider in the very land that God said would belong to his descendants. His son Isaac lived the same way, and so did his grandson Jacob. All three of them lived in tents, never settling down permanently, always moving from one location to another. They were heirs of the same promise, but none of them saw it fully realized while they were alive. This required tremendous faith to believe God's promise, even when your daily realities seemed to contradict it. Abraham could have become bitter or discouraged, questioning why God would promise him a land but never let him truly possess it. But he didn't. Why? Because Abraham was looking beyond the physical land to something greater. He was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham understood that God's ultimate promise wasn't just about owning property in Canaan. It was about something eternal, something permanent, something that would never fade or pass away. The tents he lived in had no foundations. They could be packed up and moved at any moment. But Abraham believed God was preparing a permanent dwelling place for him, a city built by God himself. This heavenly perspective kept Abraham faithful even when his circumstances looked uncertain. He could endure living as a stranger on earth because he knew he was heading toward a permanent home in heaven. Verses 11 and 12 shift the focus to Abraham's wife, Sarah, and the miraculous fulfillment of God's promise. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Sarah's story is remarkable because she faced a seemingly impossible situation. She was old, well past the age when women could have children. The natural biological clock had run out decades earlier. When God promised Abraham that he would have a son through Sarah, it seemed laughable. In fact, Sarah actually did laugh when she first heard it. How could a woman in her 90s give birth? It defied everything she knew about human biology and natural limitations. But as time went on, and Sarah watched Abraham's unwavering faith in God's promise, something changed in her heart. She began to believe, not because the circumstances became more favorable. She only got older as time passed. She believed because she considered God faithful. That's the key phrase. She considered him faithful who had made the promise. Sarah shifted her focus from her own inability to God's ability. She stopped looking at her age and started looking at God's character. If God promised it, then God would do it, no matter how impossible it seemed. And God did. Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac, whose name means laughter. The child who seemed impossible became reality. But the miracle didn't stop with Isaac's birth. Verse 12 explains the long-term impact. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. The writer refers to Abraham as good as dead because he was about 100 years old when Isaac was born, far too old by natural standards to father children. Yet from Abraham and Sarah, despite their advanced age, came an entire nation. The promise God made to Abraham, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars and as countless as the sand, actually came true. The Jewish nation descended from Isaac, and through Isaac's line would eventually come Jesus Christ, through whom people from every nation, tribe, and language would become Abraham's spiritual descendants. What seemed like a biological impossibility became the foundation for millions upon millions of people throughout history. Sarah's faith teaches us that God's timing doesn't match our timing, and his methods don't follow natural laws. When God makes a promise, he can override any obstacle, any limitation, any impossibility to bring it to pass. Verses 13 through 16 provide a broader perspective on how these faithful patriarchs viewed their lives. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. This passage reveals something profound about Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and the other faithful ones who came before. They all died still believing in promises they never saw fulfilled on earth. Abraham never owned the land of Canaan. Sarah never saw her descendants become as numerous as the stars. She only had one son through whom that promise would eventually come true. Isaac and Jacob continued living in tents, never settling down permanently. Yet all of them died in faith, still trusting God's promises. They saw these promises from a distance, like someone standing on a shore and glimpsing a far-off land across the ocean. They couldn't touch it yet, couldn't walk on it, couldn't fully experience it, but they welcomed it anyway. They embraced the promise even from afar, and they openly admitted something important. They were foreigners and strangers on earth. Think about what that means. They acknowledged that this world wasn't their final home. They were just passing through, like travelers staying temporarily in a foreign country before moving on to their real destination. When people talk this way, when they admit they're strangers on earth, it shows they're looking for a country of their own, a true homeland. The writer points out that if they had been homesick for Ur, the place they left behind, they could have gone back. Abraham had plenty of opportunities over the years to return to his old life. The journey wasn't so far that he couldn't retrace his steps. But he never did. Neither did his children or grandchildren. Why? Because they were longing for something better than Ur, better than Canaan, better than anything earth could offer. They were longing for a heavenly country, a permanent home with God himself. This heavenly focus shaped how they lived every day. It's why they could endure living in tents, facing uncertainty, and never seeing the full promise realized. They knew something better was coming. And because they lived with this faith, verse 16 tells us something beautiful. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. God actually identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not embarrassed or reluctant to be associated with them. He's proud to be called their God because they were faithful to him. And he's prepared an eternal city for them, a permanent home that will never fade or disappoint. Verses 17 through 19 describe the most difficult moment in Abraham's life. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. After waiting decades for Isaac's birth, after finally seeing the beginning of God's promise fulfilled, Abraham received a shocking command from God. God told him to take Isaac, his beloved son, the child of promise, and offer him as a sacrifice on a mountain. This wasn't a test of Abraham's religious devotion or a cruel game. It was the ultimate test of faith. Would Abraham trust God even when God's command seemed to contradict God's promise? God had specifically said that Abraham's offspring would come through Isaac, but now God was asking Abraham to kill Isaac. How could both things be true? How could Isaac be the father of many nations if he died as a young man? Abraham faced an impossible dilemma that would have shattered most people's faith. But Abraham obeyed. He took Isaac, traveled to the mountain God specified, built an altar, arranged the wood, and prepared to sacrifice his son. The Genesis account tells us that Isaac asked where the lamb for the sacrifice was, and Abraham replied that God would provide it. Even at that moment, Abraham trusted God. The writer of Hebrews explains Abraham's reasoning. He believed God could raise the dead. That's the only way everything could make sense. If God promised that Isaac would father many descendants, and if God was now commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, then Abraham concluded that God would have to bring Isaac back to life. This wasn't a wild guess or desperate hope. It was logical faith based on God's character and promises. Abraham had seen God do the impossible before, bringing Isaac into the world through elderly parents who were as good as dead. If God could create life from the dead, he could certainly restore life to the dead. So Abraham raised the knife to strike his son. At that exact moment, God stopped him. An angel called out, telling Abraham not to harm Isaac. God had seen Abraham's faith and was satisfied. God provided a ram caught in the nearby bushes to sacrifice instead of Isaac. And so, in a manner of speaking, Abraham did receive Isaac back from death. He was fully prepared to lose his son, fully committed to obeying God, and then Isaac's life was spared. It was like receiving him back from the dead, a picture of resurrection. This event revealed the depth of Abraham's faith. He trusted God, even when it meant potentially losing the very thing God had promised him. Verse 20 moves to the next generation with a brief but significant statement. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Isaac's life is marked by one particular act of faith mentioned in this chapter, the blessing he gave to his sons. In ancient times, a father's blessing carried tremendous weight. It wasn't just nice words or good wishes. It was a prophetic declaration about each son's future, and once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. The Genesis account tells us that Isaac planned to bless Esau, his firstborn son, with the primary blessing. But through a series of events involving Isaac's wife Rebekah and their younger son Jacob, Isaac ended up blessing Jacob with the firstborn's blessing instead. When Isaac discovered what had happened, he was deeply troubled, but he didn't try to reverse the blessing. He confirmed that Jacob would indeed be blessed, and he gave Esau a different blessing. What made this an act of faith? Isaac believed that these blessings would actually come true. He wasn't just speaking empty words or following cultural traditions. He genuinely believed God would bring about what he declared over his sons. Even though Isaac couldn't control the future, even though he couldn't see how events would unfold, he trusted that God would honor the blessings he pronounced. Isaac spoke about Jacob becoming great, about nations serving him, about him having authority over his brother. He spoke about Esau living by his sword and eventually throwing off Jacob's authority. These weren't things Isaac could make happen through his own power. He had to trust God to orchestrate the future according to the words he spoke. And that's exactly what happened. Jacob became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, while Esau became the father of the Edomites. The blessings Isaac spoke came true over the following generations, proving that his faith was well placed. Isaac's example shows us that faith sometimes means speaking God's truth about the future, even when you can't see how it will unfold, trusting that God will honor his purposes in the next generation. Verses 21 and 22 conclude this section with the faith of Jacob and Joseph. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Jacob's faith showed itself at the end of his life. He was old, weak, and dying in Egypt, far from the promised land of Canaan. But even in his final moments, Jacob's faith remained strong. He called Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to his bedside and blessed them. These boys had been born in Egypt and raised in Egyptian culture. Joseph had become a powerful ruler in Egypt, and his sons enjoyed privileged positions there, but Jacob blessed them as if they were his own sons, incorporating them fully into the family line that would inherit God's promises. He even crossed his hands to give the greater blessing to the younger son rather than the older, showing that God's choices don't always follow human expectations. After blessing Joseph's sons, Jacob worshipped God while leaning on his staff. Even in weakness, even at death's door, Jacob turned his heart toward God in worship. His faith didn't fade with age or diminish in difficulty. He believed God's promises about the future, even though he was dying in a foreign land. Joseph's faith appears in verse 22. When his end was near, Joseph spoke about something that wouldn't happen for 400 years, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Joseph had lived his entire adult life in Egypt. He had risen from slavery to become second in command of the entire nation. Egypt had been good to him in many ways, but Joseph knew Egypt wasn't home. He knew God had promised the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants, and he believed that promise would come true. So Joseph gave specific instructions. When the Israelites eventually leave Egypt and return to Canaan, they should take his bones with them. He didn't want to be buried permanently in Egypt. He wanted his final resting place to be in the Promised Land, even if it meant his bones would have to wait centuries before being moved there. This was pure faith. Joseph couldn't see the Exodus. He wouldn't live to witness it, but he believed it would happen so strongly that he made plans for it, and he was right. Hundreds of years later, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, they took Joseph's bones with them, just as he had requested. Joseph was eventually buried in Canaan, in the land God had promised. His faith reached across centuries, trusting that God would keep his word long after Joseph himself had died. The chapter now moves to one of the most dramatic periods in Israel's history, beginning with verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. To understand the courage this required, you need to know what was happening in Egypt at this time. The Israelites had been living there for generations, and their population had grown so large that Pharaoh felt threatened. He feared they might become too powerful, so he issued a horrific command. Every Hebrew baby boy born must be thrown into the Nile River and drowned. Egyptian midwives were ordered to kill Hebrew boys at birth. It was systematic genocide targeting an entire generation of male children. Into this nightmare, Moses was born. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, looked at their newborn son and saw something special about him. The text says they saw he was no ordinary child. Some translations say he was beautiful or fine, but it was more than just physical appearance. There was something about this baby that convinced his parents God had a plan for him, so they made a dangerous decision. They would hide him. For 3 months, they kept Moses concealed in their home, somehow managing to keep a newborn baby quiet enough that no one would discover him. Every day they risked their lives and the lives of their other children. If they were caught hiding a Hebrew baby boy, the consequences would have been severe. The king's edict wasn't a suggestion. It was law, backed by the full power of Egypt's government and military. People who disobeyed Pharaoh's commands faced death, but Moses' parents were not afraid. That doesn't mean they felt no fear. It means they refused to let fear control their actions. Their faith in God was stronger than their fear of Pharaoh. They believed God valued this child's life more than Pharaoh's cruel law did. They trusted that somehow, some way, God would protect their son. When Moses grew too big to hide any longer, his mother made a waterproof basket, placed him in it, and set it among the reeds along the Nile River, the very river where Pharaoh had commanded Hebrew boys to be thrown. But instead of drowning, Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The very edict meant to destroy him became the means of giving him a privileged position in Pharaoh's household. Moses' parents never saw him become the great deliverer who would lead Israel out of Egypt, but their faith preserved the one God would use to save an entire nation. Their courage in the face of death threats shows that faith sometimes means protecting what God values, even when powerful people command otherwise. Verses 24 through 26 describe Moses' own faith and the remarkable choice he made as an adult. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses had everything most people dream of having. He was raised in the palace as Egyptian royalty. He had access to the best education, the finest food, luxurious clothing, servants, power, and wealth. The treasures of Egypt were literally at his fingertips. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world, and Moses was positioned to enjoy all its benefits. He could have lived his entire life in comfort, never worrying about money or status or security. But Moses made a choice that shocked everyone. He refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He rejected his royal identity and the privileges that came with it. Why would anyone walk away from such an incredible position? Because Moses remembered who he really was. He was a Hebrew, one of God's people who were suffering as slaves. The more Moses saw of his people's oppression, the more he realized he couldn't just enjoy palace life while his brothers and sisters labored under cruel masters. So Moses chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than enjoy what the text calls the fleeting pleasures of sin. The pleasures of Egyptian royalty weren't inherently evil, but for Moses to enjoy them while ignoring his people's suffering would have been sinful. Those pleasures were also temporary. Fleeting means they wouldn't last. Moses could see beyond the immediate comfort to the bigger picture. He understood that siding with God's people might mean suffering in the short term, but it aligned him with God's purposes for the long term. The text says something fascinating. Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than Egypt's treasures. This is remarkable because Moses lived over 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Yet the writer connects Moses' sacrifice to Christ, showing that Moses understood he was part of God's redemptive plan that would ultimately point to the Messiah. Moses counted the disgrace, the shame, the rejection he would face as more valuable than all of Egypt's wealth. That's an incredible statement. Gold, jewels, power, prestige. Moses had access to all of it, and he considered it worthless compared to being identified with God's people and God's purposes. What enabled Moses to make this choice? The verse tells us he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses wasn't focused on immediate circumstances. He was thinking about eternal rewards, about what God would give him that would far outlast anything Egypt could offer. This future focus gave him the strength to walk away from temporary pleasures and embrace temporary suffering. Verses 27 through 29 describe two pivotal moments in Israel's exodus from Egypt. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Moses' departure from Egypt required tremendous courage. After choosing to identify with his people, Moses killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. When Pharaoh found out, he tried to kill Moses, forcing Moses to flee into the desert where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. Later, when God called Moses to return to Egypt and demand that Pharaoh release the Israelites, Moses had every reason to fear. Pharaoh was still angry, still powerful, still dangerous. But Moses went anyway. He didn't let fear of the king's anger stop him from obeying God. How did Moses find such courage? The text explains he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Moses had encountered God at the burning bush. He had heard God's voice, received God's commission, and witnessed God's power. Even though God is invisible, Moses saw him with the eyes of faith. That vision of God was more real to Moses than the visible threat of Pharaoh. When you truly see God, when you understand his power, his presence, his purposes, earthly rulers become less intimidating. Moses persevered through years of confronting Pharaoh, through plague after plague, through constant opposition, because he kept his eyes fixed on the invisible God who was greater than any visible enemy. Then came the Passover, one of the most significant events in Israel's history. God told Moses that he would send one final plague, the death of every firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's household to the poorest families. But God provided a way for Israel to be protected. Each family was to sacrifice a lamb and put its blood on the door frames of their house. When the destroyer passed through Egypt that night, he would pass over every house marked with blood. By faith, Moses kept the Passover. He followed God's instructions exactly and told all of Israel to do the same. This required faith because the instructions seemed strange. How could blood on a doorframe protect anyone from death? But Moses trusted that God's method would work, even if he didn't understand the mechanics of it. That night, just as God promised, every firstborn in Egypt died, except in the houses marked with blood. The Israelites were spared, because they obeyed in faith. Pharaoh finally released the people, and Moses led millions of Israelites out of Egypt. But Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his army to recapture them. The Israelites found themselves trapped between the Egyptian army behind them and the Red Sea in front of them. There was no escape. Then God performed an incredible miracle. He told Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, and the waters divided, creating a path of dry ground through the middle of the sea with walls of water on both sides. By faith, the people walked through the Red Sea as if they were on dry land. Can you imagine the courage that took? Walking between towering walls of water that could crash down at any moment, but they trusted God and kept moving forward. Every man, woman, child, and animal in Israel crossed safely to the other side. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the waters came crashing back down, drowning Pharaoh's entire army. The same sea that saved Israel destroyed Egypt. Faith made the difference. Israel believed God would protect them and walked through, while Egypt pursued in unbelief and perished. Verses 30 and 31 shift the story forward to Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. After 40 years in the wilderness, Israel finally stood ready to enter Canaan. The first major obstacle was Jericho, a heavily fortified city with massive walls. Jericho wasn't just any city, it was a fortress designed to withstand military attacks. Its walls were so thick that houses were built into them. From a military standpoint, taking Jericho would require a long siege or sophisticated weapons. But God had a different plan. He told Joshua to have the Israelite army march around the city once a day for 6 days, with priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and when the priests gave a long blast on the trumpets, all the people were to shout loudly. Then the walls would collapse. This strategy made no military sense. Marching around a city doesn't knock down walls. Trumpets and shouting don't demolish fortifications, but Joshua and the people obeyed. Day after day, they marched around Jericho in silence, except for the trumpet sounds. The people inside Jericho must have watched in confusion. On the 7th day, after the 7th lap around the city, the trumpets blared and the people shouted. Suddenly, impossibly, the massive walls of Jericho collapsed flat, allowing Israel's army to rush in and capture the city. By faith, the walls fell, not because of military might, but because God's people trusted his unusual battle plan and obeyed it completely. But there's another faith hero in this story, Rahab, the prostitute. Before the battle, Joshua had sent 2 spies into Jericho to scout the city. They ended up at Rahab's house, which was built into the city wall. When the king of Jericho heard about the spies and sent men to capture them, Rahab hid the spies on her roof and lied to the soldiers, sending them off in the wrong direction. Why would Rahab risk her life to protect enemy spies? Because she had faith. She told the spies that everyone in Jericho had heard about Israel's God and the miracles he performed, how he dried up the Red Sea, how he gave Israel victory over other nations. Rahab said, "I know that the Lord has given you this land." She believed in Israel's God, even though she was a Canaanite prostitute living in a pagan city. She recognized that the God of Israel was the true God, and she wanted to be on his side. Before the spies left, they made a deal with Rahab. When Israel attacked, she should hang a scarlet cord from her window and gather all her family inside her house. Everyone in that house would be spared when the city fell. Rahab did exactly as instructed. When the walls collapsed and Israel conquered Jericho, Rahab and her entire family were saved. Because she welcomed the spies in faith, she was not killed with those who were disobedient. The rest of Jericho perished because they refused to submit to God, but Rahab lived because she believed. Even more remarkably, Rahab didn't just survive. She was welcomed into Israel and eventually became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. A Canaanite prostitute became an ancestor of the Messiah because of her faith. Her story proves that faith in God matters more than your past, your reputation, or your background. Verses 32 through the first part of 35 pick up speed, rushing through hundreds of years of Israel's history. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. The writer acknowledges he can't tell every story of faith in detail. There are simply too many. So he begins listing names and accomplishments, giving us a rapid overview of faith heroes throughout Israel's history. Gideon was a judge who defeated a massive Midianite army with only 300 men, trusting God's unconventional battle strategy. Barak led Israel to victory over a Canaanite army with iron chariots, something that should have been impossible. Samson, despite his moral failures, performed incredible feats of strength through faith in God, including killing a lion with his bare hands and defeating entire armies. Jephthah, though he came from a broken background, led Israel to victory over the Ammonites. David, the shepherd boy who became king, killed the giant Goliath with a sling and a stone, trusting that God would deliver the Philistine into his hand. Samuel was the prophet and judge who anointed Israel's first kings and faithfully spoke God's word even when it wasn't popular. Beyond these named individuals, there were countless prophets who spoke God's truth in dangerous times. Through faith, these heroes conquered kingdoms. Israel under Joshua, David, and other leaders took control of Canaan and surrounding territories, not through superior military strength, but through faith in God's promises. They administered justice, establishing God's law and protecting the vulnerable in society. They gained what was promised, seeing God fulfill His word in their lifetimes. Some shut the mouths of lions. Most famously, Daniel spent a night in a lion's den and emerged unharmed because he trusted God. Others quenched the fury of flames. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a blazing furnace for refusing to worship an idol. But they walked around inside the fire without even the smell of smoke on their clothes. Many escaped the edge of the sword, surviving assassination attempts and battles that should have killed them. Faith turned weakness into strength. People who were naturally timid became bold. Those who were physically weak accomplished mighty deeds. The powerless became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies far stronger than themselves. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. The widow of Zarephath's son was raised to life through Elijah's prayer. The Shunammite woman's son was raised through Elisha's prayer. These weren't isolated miracles. They were testimonies to the power of faith in God who gives life to the dead. All of these accomplishments, all of these victories, all of these miracles happened through faith. These weren't perfect people. Many of them made serious mistakes and struggled with sin. But when they trusted God and acted on that trust, God worked through them to accomplish things that would have been impossible through human strength alone. The chapter concludes with verses 35 through 40, shifting from triumph to suffering. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Not every story of faith ends with miraculous deliverance or military victory. The writer now acknowledges the faithful ones who suffered terribly without earthly rescue. Some were tortured, stretched on racks, or beaten repeatedly. Their tormentors offered them release if they would only renounce their faith in God, but they refused. They chose ongoing torture rather than deny the God they believed in. Why would anyone make that choice? Because they were looking forward to a better resurrection. They understood that temporary relief bought with compromise would cost them something far more valuable: eternal life with God. They believed resurrection was coming, and they wanted the best resurrection, the one reserved for the faithful. Some faced jeers and flogging. They were mocked publicly, humiliated in front of crowds, and beaten with whips. Others were put in chains and thrown into prison, spending years or even decades locked away for their faith. Some were stoned to death, like Zechariah, who was killed between the temple and the altar for speaking God's truth. According to tradition, the prophet Isaiah was sawed in two during the reign of an evil king. Others were killed by the sword, executed for refusing to worship false gods or for prophesying against wicked rulers. Many became refugees, fleeing persecution and living in poverty. They went about wearing sheepskins and goatskins because they couldn't afford regular clothing. They were destitute, owning nothing, constantly on the move to escape those who wanted to kill them. They were persecuted relentlessly and mistreated in every way. The writer makes a stunning statement about these suffering faithful. The world was not worthy of them. The world treated them as worthless, as people to be despised and destroyed. But the reality was the opposite. These faithful believers were too good for the world, too valuable, too righteous. The world didn't deserve to have such people in it, yet it rejected them anyway. They wandered in deserts, living in harsh conditions far from civilization. They hid in mountains, finding shelter in caves and holes in the ground, like animals seeking refuge. They had no homes, no security, no comfort. Day after day, they survived on the margins, separated from normal society because of their faith. Yet here's what's remarkable. These were all commended for their faith. God approved of them just as much as He approved of those who conquered kingdoms and shut the mouths of lions. Suffering doesn't mean you've lost God's favor. Sometimes the most faithful are the ones who endure without rescue, who trust God even when He doesn't immediately deliver them from pain. But none of them, not the conquerors or the sufferers, received what had been ultimately promised during their earthly lives. They all died looking forward to something they hadn't yet seen. Why? Because God had planned something better. His plan included us, everyone who would believe after Christ came, died, and rose again. God designed history so that the Old Testament faithful and the New Testament faithful would be perfected together, united in the fulfillment of all God's promises. The heroes of faith in this chapter didn't see the full picture, but they trusted God anyway, and their faith carved out a path for every believer who would follow. If the faith of these ancient heroes could move mountains, part seas, and sustain them through impossible trials, imagine what that same faith can do in your life today. Their stories weren't written just to inspire us. They were written to show us that God is still the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same God who kept His promises to Abraham is keeping His promises to you. The same God who delivered Israel through the Red Sea can deliver you through whatever you're facing right now. These men and women proved that faith isn't about having all the answers or seeing the full picture. It's about trusting God one step at a time, even when the path ahead looks impossible. If this journey through Hebrews 11 has strengthened your faith or opened your eyes to what trusting God really means, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel so you can continue exploring the powerful stories and truths hidden in Scripture. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that faith can move them from where they are to where God wants them to be. And remember, you're not just learning about faith heroes from the past. You're being called to become a faith hero for your generation, someone whose trust in God will speak long after you're gone, just like Abel's faith still speaks today.